Hello, Ring of Fire radio podcast listener. You are listening to a free version of the Ring of Fire radio podcast. It's a free version. It's 1/3 of our complete radio show that we do on a weekly basis. Folks, you don't know what you're missing, and you don't know what you're missing because you're not a member. For just pennies a week, well, quarters a week, you can become a member of this show. You'll get the full show without commercials. You'll get complete access to our archives. And really, more importantly, you will support independent media at a time where corporate interests have become dominant over virtually every sector of our lives. So head over to rofpodcast.com right now. Sign up to become a member of this podcast. You'll be happy you did. Welcome to Ring of Fire Radio. I'm Sam Seder. Today on Ring of Fire Radio, Harvard professor Lawrence Lessig will join us to discuss his lawsuit against the Electoral College in an effort to make sure everyone's vote is equal. Nation contributor Danny McLean on the protests in St. Louis this week, and if Black Lives Matter can win in the age of Trump. Heather Digby Parton from Salon will be here to help break down the important news stories from this week you may have missed. And investigative journalist David Dane will stop by to explain what Betsy DeVos has been up to. We'll discuss the growing anti-monopoly sentiment in the Democratic Party. Folks, don't forget you can go to rofpodcast.com and sign up for the free 1-hour version of the Ring of Fire radio podcast. That's rofpodcast.com. Here to help recap this week in news, Heather Parton from Salon, or as you may know her from her blog, Hullabaloo, Digby. So, Heather, I want to start this week with a piece of news that has been, it seems to me, the import of this news has been overshadowed a bit. And maybe it's just because people are tired of this fight. People can't sort of key into the notion that this fight continues. But we have reported the death of the Republicans' attempt to repeal and, I guess, arguably replace, but not really replace, right? It's to put a placeholder in of the Affordable Care Act. This has happened now at least 2 times where we thought this was over and done. Republicans learned that nobody wants worse health care or less health care than they have today. In fact, most people want more access to health care and less expensive rather than the opposite. That seems fairly intuitive, but the Republicans still have not learned the lesson. Thus, we have Graham Cassidy. This is a bill that has been released, and we only know the broad contours of it, and we may not ever know, at least until after a vote, what it's really going to do, how bad it's going to be for our healthcare system. But it is a package that has been presented by Lindsey Graham and John Cassidy of Louisiana. Lindsey Graham, of course, South Carolina senators, both. And they are looking to essentially, in the short term, block grant Medicaid and then ultimately virtually eliminate the program about 11 years out in 2027. They are going to get rid of the protections, or let's put it this way. They're going to get rid of the federal protections for things like pre-existing conditions, for things like lifetime caps and yearly caps and all of the benefits that you would get with the Affordable Care Act that compel insurance companies to offer a product that's actually what we think it is. There's more, but those are the big headlines. And of course, it's going to raise premiums. And nobody seems to be paying the level of attention to this that they should be.
Well, I mean, I think, that is a good question. Why that hasn't happened, why people aren't paying attention. I do think I'd like to just give a little bit of criticism to our Democratic leadership on that, because I think that it's always a big mistake, and Democrats have a bad habit of doing this, going way back on a million different, bills in which they take premature victory laps. They love to walk around saying, ding dong, the witch is dead, or yay, we won, we prevailed, look how great we are. And these things come back. These zombie bills like this come back, and then everybody is sort of disbanded the opposition because they thought that the whole thing was done, and it wasn't. And so here we are now. We're facing this deadline of, September 30th, so there's very little time to regroup and put together the kind of very effective opposition that happened all over the country at various, town halls and in Washington, and people, the disability advocates who were, being dragged out of congressional offices, out of their wheelchairs. I mean, this was stuff that was very, very powerful. So they've got to re-up again and come back and do it again. And I think that it would behoove Democrats in the future that until the deadline runs out on something, maybe not declare victory, because these people have a habit of coming back. Having said that, hopefully over, this last gasp of this, and maybe you can explain better than I can why this September 30th deadline exists, but it does. In order to pass this Graham-Cassidy bill, they need to do it by September 30th because it can pass with only 50 votes. And if it goes past that without passing, then in order to do any health care reform under this particular budget resolution, they would have to get 60 votes. It would be subject to the filibuster. So they need to do this quickly, and we're going to watch this play out again. And meanwhile, by the way, people are tortured by this, Sam. People are tortured watching this. I'm one of them. I watch it every time this happens. My stomach is churning, and I'm going to lose my health care. And for a lot of people, that's a life and death proposition. And this is disgusting. It is. It's the same thing with the Dream Kids. These people are torturers. That is what they're doing here with all this, rigmarole with them wanting to repeal, rights, repeal, people's ability to actually live here. They're doing this over and over again, and it's absolutely disgusting.
Yeah, well, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more, and I think it's just a complete the level of cynicism and the complete lack of compassion that's involved in this it's so off the charts. And what is also amazing, we'll talk about this in the next segment as we dig into this bill a little bit more. What is amazing to me is that the same people who postured and preened in the Republican Party last time are supposedly on the fence about this one. We don't really know. But this bill is significantly worse than the skinny repeal. The skinny repeal was just set up so they could get to something like the original bill, which was the BCRA, the Better Care Replacement Act, or something to that effect, which was actually less destructive than this one seems to be. And remember, that one kicked off over 20 some odd million people off their insurance within the first 5 or 6 years. Also destroyed protections for people with pre-existing conditions. But we'll get to that in a moment. It is virtually impossible for a layperson to explain why September 30th is the deadline. But it basically comes down to this. And there's one other aspect to this that is just sort of shocking. At the beginning of the session, the Republicans in the Senate voted to create 2 bills. They were reconciliation bills. One was for the 2017 budget. The other was for the 2018 budget. Apparently, the authority in the first one, the 2017, the parliamentarian has ruled that it runs out the night of September 30th. This reconciliation bill, that's the bill that they're voting on, and then any health care bill is actually an amendment to that bill. So we have the first amendment to that bill was the skinny repeal. In fact, there were others, I think, that night that failed, and the skinny repeal was the last one to fail. And the authority for the reconciliation runs out. And what that means is only through a reconciliation process are you allowed a 50+1 victory. Otherwise, it's subject to the normal rules to regular order of the Senate, which involves potential for filibusters or other types of amendment processes, etc. And so they need to do this by then. And one of the untold stories is, well, in fact, I'll tell you what that untold story is when we come back in a moment. But when we do, let's talk about the timing. Let's talk about the timing that has to happen with this vote and the actual practical processes. Folks will not believe how much time is left to debate this bill. Whatever you think that number is, unless you've heard specifically the number, you will never guess it, and we will tell you what it is when we return. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. I'm talking to the great Digby, Heather Parton. We'll be right back.
Can you even see what you're fighting for? Bloodlust and a holy war. Listen up, hear the patriots shout. Times are changing.
Hey folks, Mike Papantonio's new book entitled Law and Vengeance, which is the follow-up to his critically acclaimed novel Law and Disorder, is finally out and available to you to buy. The book is a legal and political thriller drawing on Pap's experience both as a skilled trial lawyer and as a nationally syndicated political talk show host. The story follows trial lawyer Gina Romano, who was first introduced in Law and Disorder, on her quest for both vengeance and justice in a whistleblower lawsuit against a weapons manufacturer who developed and sold a dangerously defective rifle scope. Pap has built a story around real-life events that he's encountered as one of the top trial lawyers in America, where he's been fighting some of the world's largest and most corrupt corporations. Buy Mike Papantonio's new book, Law and Vengeance, today. Go to www.lawandvengeance.com. That's lawandvengeance.com. Check it out. I know you're going to love it. Welcome back to Ring of Fire Radio. I'm Sam Seder here with Heather Digby Parton from Salon. So Heather, in the last segment, we were talking about the Graham-Cassidy bill, which is the latest in the repeal and destroy Medicaid attempt by the Republican Party. They have until September 30th because of fairly arcane parliamentary procedure rules in the Senate. But those same arcane parliamentary procedure rules, Heather, will allow for not a couple of days worth of debate, not a couple of weeks worth of debate. Remember, we've told hundreds of times that healthcare represents 20% of the nation's economy. There is 90 to 120 seconds left for them to debate, because this is an amendment to the original 2017 reconciliation bill. There will only be about 2 minutes of debate. There'll be no committee hearings. There'll be no public comments. On top of that, there very well may not be a Congressional Budget Office score. In other words, we won't know how much it will raise premiums or how many millions of people will lose health insurance because of this bill. And yet, Heather, there is a fairly significant chance this bill may pass.
Oh, I think there's a good chance it's going to pass. And, I'm trying not to be too pessimistic. I mean, we've been down this road several times, as you mentioned earlier. This zombie bill has been defeated and come back more than once. And, of course, the last time was a very dramatic moment when John McCain got up off of his sickbed, came back to Washington, gave a big speech about regular order, and then voted against it in the end, and it lost by one vote. So we're facing that same thing again. There will be no debate, as you pointed out. And McCain had made a very big deal about the fact that he thought this should go through regular order. And what that means is it should have gone through the committees. It should have had hearings. There should have been expert testimony. They should have the full CBO report, it should be done like bills have always been done before. In other words, people should know what they're voting for. There should be plenty of discussion about what it is and whether or not it works, et cetera, et cetera. He had made a very big deal out of that and said that was his main problem with the bill last time. So now this time, there's even less than there was last time, and there was virtually nothing. But this time, the CBO report is apparently not going to be able to score how horrible this bill is. They don't have time. So there won't be any discussion of how much it's going to cost, how much premiums are going to go up, how much coverage is really going to be, how many people are going to be involved. I mean, this is going to be a very vague idea of what's going to happen, and they've constructed it with the idea that most of the pain will be shifted from the early years to the further out years, which I guess is supposed to fool people.
Well, it actually, it was designed because the CBO only scores the first 10 years. So by 2026, the federal government would be spending 17% less on subsidies in the exchanges and on Medicaid expansion. In 2027, all of that money is gone.
Right.
All of
it's
zeroed
gone.
out.
And if you look at a chart, you can just see this dramatic drop-off in 1 year from 2026 to 2027. It's unbelievable. So this is bait and switch. They're pretending as if this is some kind of a more moderate approach, and of course it actually isn't. It's the opposite, and many of the experts are saying it's worse than what we've seen before from what they did in the House and from the earlier Senate attempts at the bill, and especially the skinny bill, which lost by 1 vote. So here we have this dynamic where we've got, the same senators who are on the hot seat, and everybody is waiting to see what they're going to do, which is Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, who's, probably a no, Rand Paul, who has said he's a no, then you've got McCain, and you've got Lisa Murkowski in Alaska. McCain being one of the, the sort of, tipping point, which, the last time he was the vote that finally took it over the end, and we didn't know till the very final moment what he was going to do. One of the dynamics on this one is that his best friend in the Senate, Lindsey Graham, is one of the sponsors of this bill and is pushing very hard for McCain to, come out and back his buddy here. And McCain is all over the map with it. We don't know what he's really thinking. He at first said that if his governor was for it, he'd be for it. He says he really wants regular order, but that doesn't mean he won't vote for it, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, he is an unreliable vote, and I don't know how anybody's going to be able to persuade him, because whatever is motivating him at this point is kind of beyond. It has little to do with policy. This has got something to do with his personal sort of relationship with Graham and how he wants his legacy to be. So,
and
that's a very difficult problem.
That's a very difficult problem, but, this gives an opportunity. Obviously, if you live in Alaska, if you live in Maine, if you live in Kentucky, you call your senators, because those are the ones, like you say, are part of the fulcrum. But I would include, folks like Portman in Ohio and Capito Moore in West Virginia. But I would say, no matter who you are and where you live, call John McCain's office, because those are the two things. Digby's just laid it out, the two things that operate for John McCain, who, probably has a terminal case of brain cancer at this point, and is not looking to for re-election. He is looking to maintain his legacy, and to call and say, you have been, suck it up, folks. You say something, you've been a lion of the Senate, and your adherence to regular order has been impressive. Don't let us down now in your most visible, perhaps, final, most important vote in the Senate. That's something to do. Call your senators. Call John McCain, even if he's not your senator. We have to take a break. But, Digby, if you'll join me in the next hour, we got a lot more to talk about, including some of this stuff. We'll be right back with more Ring of Fire Radio, and Heather Parton will join me in the next hour. Coming up, Harvard professor Lawrence Lessig on how he's fighting to make sure every vote is treated equally. I'm Sam Seder. You're listening to Ring of Fire Radio.
I know the score at the back of my hand. Them other boy, I don't give a damn. They kiss on the ring. I carry the crown. Nothing can break.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire Radio. I'm Sam Seder. Our next guest has begun a lawsuit that he hopes will reform the way the Electoral College is distributed. Here to tell us why the Electoral College distorts our elections and why he wants to make sure every vote is equal, Harvard professor Lawrence Lessig. So, Professor, you are pursuing a legal case. Who would be the plaintiffs and who would be the defendants in this case?
Well, we haven't settled finally on the states, but we will have plaintiffs. We've identified plaintiffs in a red state and plaintiffs in a blue state. And in the red state, those plaintiffs are Democrats, and in the blue state, those plaintiffs are Republicans. And these are plaintiffs who say, my vote never matters. No matter what I do, my vote will never be counted at the federal level to determine who the next president is. And we believe that violates their rights under the Equal Protection Clause that guarantees everybody's vote should count the same.
So, I mean, how is it that if I'm, let's say, a Republican voter in the state of Massachusetts, or if I'm a Democratic voter in the state of Wyoming, how is it that my vote doesn't matter in the presidential election?
Well, the presidential system, as everyone knows, is ultimately determined by the votes of the electors to the Electoral College. Those electors are specified by the Constitution, and we're not challenging the Electoral College or the fact or the number of electors specified by the Constitution. But the states have adopted a rule called winner take all, which says that the person who wins the popular vote gets all of the Electoral College votes. So even if you win by just a single ballot, you get all the Electoral College votes of that state. And so what that means is that at this intermediate level on the way up to determining who the president of the United States will be, if you happen to vote for someone who doesn't win your state, your vote doesn't get reflected in the ultimate vote for the president. And that's the sense in which the system is discarding the votes, contingently discarding the votes of voters at this intermediate stage. And that's the character of the system that we believe renders it unconstitutional.
Now, where is it that, I mean, how is it, and I know there are two states that do proportional. In other words, the electoral, and actually it's sort of a mix, right? It's there are two states that do this in a different way. What are those two states, and how do they do it differently than the rest of the states?
No, you're right. It's a mix. So Maine and Nebraska allocate their senator electoral votes. Every state gets 2 electors for their senators. They allocate their senator electoral votes on a winner-take-all basis. So if you win the state of Maine, you get both senator electors. But then they allocate the rest of their electors by congressional district. So if you win the congressional district, you get the elector for that congressional district. And that dynamic creates an almost proportional system. It's not the system that we actually will be pressing for. We want to be pressing for a fully proportional system. And that's, in a small state, you can see why the 2 votes for the senator means it's not fully proportional. But it's more proportional than winner-take-all, where when you get all the votes if you get the majority in the particular state.
All right, so let me play the role of Chief Justice Roberts, and you are litigating this case, and I say to you, well, Professor Lessig, you're not your plaintiffs aren't voting for the president of the United States when they go to vote. I mean, we colloquially talk about voting for the president, but they're in fact voting for electors who actually, don't even necessarily have to reflect what the vote tally in their state is. I mean, there's a small fine if they don't. But you're voting for electors, and so your vote does count. You're just losing.
Yeah. So I would say, Mr. Chief Justice, as this court has made perfectly clear, while states are free to select electors however they want, once they decide to vest in voters the right to vote for presidential candidates, the principle of one person, one vote restricts the state in how they actually tally or recount those votes. And the court has held that since 1968, and most recently held that in a case you might have heard of called Bush v. Gore. In Bush v. Gore, the The question was, in the presidential selection system, did Florida's recount violate the one-person, one-vote principle of the 14th Amendment? And what the court said was, well, the system for recounting in some counties is different from the system for recounting in other counties, and that difference violates the principle of equality as applied to the presidential electoral system. So we're not asking the court to make any new law with respect to that. What we're asking them to see is that the winner-take-all system violates one person, one vote.
Let me continue to play my role because I just call balls and strikes, as you've heard me say in the past. But didn't we also say in Bush v. Gore? I wasn't here as John Roberts, but didn't we say in Bush v. Gore this doesn't count for any other case but Bush v. Gore?
You said something close to that, Your Honor. The court said that. The court's never clarified precisely what that has meant. But the court has also said repeatedly, and the justice I clerked for, Justice Scalia, made this argument expressly, that when you decide a case, that decision binds your decision and the decision of lower courts in the future. So if you set a principle in Bush versus Gore that says the 14th Amendment applies one person, one vote to the presidential selection system, we believe you should apply it in this case too. And if you're not going to apply it in this case too, we want to understand exactly why there's one 14th Amendment when it benefits a Republican candidate for president, and another 14th Amendment in every other context. Now, I actually don't think the Supreme Court is going to insist that Bush v. Gore only applied it to Bush v. Gore. I think they're going to recognize there's a principle here, and that principle has been a long-standing 50 years in running, and that principle, we think, clearly is violated by the Equal Protection Clause, by the winner-take-all system that states adopt for allocating electoral college votes.
And don't we have a similar, though, dynamic that exists with the Senate? I mean, if I am a voter in Wyoming, I can control, I have a much bigger stake in the U.S. Senate than you as a constituent of Massachusetts or of New York State.
Absolutely. And what the court has basically said is that the Senate gets a constitutional pass. And so does the Electoral College get a constitutional pass. I mean, the fact that Wyoming gets 3 electors and big states like California get like 57 or 58 electors is a radically unequal allocation of voter strength because California is much greater proportion, multiple of that than the difference between those two numbers of electors. That's why we're not challenging the Electoral College. We're not saying that the allocation of electors is the constitutional problem, even though that's unequal. What we're saying is we're challenging something that's not in the Constitution, something that's passed by state law. The states are the ones that have decided that winner-take-all is the rule for allocating electors in the particular states. And so we're challenging that state law. If the state said, Democratic votes in Massachusetts are worth 2 times the vote of every Republican vote. And every Democratic ballot we will count as 2, and every Republican ballot will count as 1. There's no question that that rule would violate the Constitution, even though it's the state determining how to pick electors, even though the state has the constitutional power, plenary constitutional power to pick electors. The court has been absolutely crystal clear that it must do so respecting the one person, one vote principle, and we think winner-take-all violates that principle.
All right, we need to take a break, but when we come back, I want to ask you, about the national popular vote. If this movement, if this case that you're talking about will in any way compete with the move to change the way that electoral votes are allocated across the country, we'll talk about that. Also, the mechanics of how you get a case to the Supreme Court, both in terms of like how you go about raising the funds for this, but also, what has to happen between the time that you raise those funds and you get to the court. And then lastly, I'm going to ask you if there isn't an opportunity on a state level to perhaps isolate a couple of states to get them to change to this style of allocating electoral votes. We got to take a quick break. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. I'm talking to Professor Lawrence Lessig about his case that he is hoping to bring to the Supreme Court, forcing a change in the way that we allocate electoral votes in this country. We're back on Ring of Fire Radio. I'm Sam Seder. Right now I'm talking with Harvard professor Lawrence Lessig about his lawsuit to reform the Electoral College and make sure every vote is equally valued. So, Professor, when we broke, you were telling us about what the nature of this case would be. You are essentially hoping to get to the Supreme Court and to argue that when states do winner-take-all, which virtually every state does, but Nebraska and Maine in this country, when they do winner-take-all in a presidential election, in terms of allocating their electoral votes, they are denying equal protection to its citizens by failing to uphold the one vote, one person, or one person, one vote principle. And so I would ask you, how do you bring this case? You told me that you're looking for plaintiffs, a Democrat in a red state and a Republican in a blue state, because their votes don't matter if they're going to lose the popular vote there and all the electoral votes end up going to one candidate. Once you've found those plaintiffs, what needs to happen?
Well, we've actually found the plaintiffs. We're just not in a position to announce the states because we got to pull the suits together. But what happens is we file a lawsuit in each district court in both of those cases, in both of those states, and we ask the federal court to apply the constitutional principle to winner take all. And the hope is that one of those courts agrees with us. You know, the likelihood is courts are very conservative with a small c. They don't like to change things much. So the likelihood is that they don't. But if we can get one court to go with us, then that creates what we call a split in the authority of the jurisdictions. And if there's a split in the authority of the jurisdictions, one court going one way and the other court going another way, the Supreme Court would be almost required, especially in a case as important as this, to take the case and resolve it itself. So our hope is to, as quickly as possible, get this question before the court, because obviously if we're going to have an effect on the presidential election, we have to do it long enough in advance that people can actually adjust their campaigns to the way in which the rules will work.
And what happens if both courts agree with you or both courts disagree with you?
Well, if both courts disagree with us, then there's a significant chance the court would just ignore it. If both courts agreed with us, though, there's no doubt that the Supreme Court would take it up right away, because the court's not going to allow one rule to apply in one part of the country and another rule to apply in another part of the country. The court's going to want to make sure that there's a uniform rule applying across the country for picking the president of the United States.
And just to be, just to clarify, if you were to win in one of these federal courts, there would be several states that would be under that jurisdiction and would have to change the way they allocate their electoral college.
Yeah, but my expectation is the Supreme Court would stay any ruling, so it wouldn't actually force the state to follow the ruling until it had a chance to review it, because it's such an important question, and being uniform in the approach across the country is so important that the court, I think, would make sure that it put its imprimatur before the rules actually had to change.
So briefly, the National Popular Vote movement. Will you just explain what that is to folks and why this doesn't, what you're doing doesn't conflict and maybe in some ways supports the National Popular Vote movement?
Yeah, it absolutely supports it. The National Popular Vote initiative is a genius idea to make it so that the electors in the Electoral College are actually voting for the winner of the National Popular Vote. And basically, the states are forming a compact that says that when 270 electors have joined the compact, meaning states that represent 270 electors, those states pledge to pledge their electors to vote for the winner of the National Popular Vote. So this is a way to guarantee perfect one person, one vote nationally. And I absolutely support that movement, and there's a lot of really incredibly talented people pushing to get state legislatures to adopt that compact. The problem is that right now it's got a pretty heavy lift to get a bunch of Republican states to join. That's the only way to get it over 270 right now. And so what we're trying to do is really complementary. So we're saying that everybody's vote should count equally. That's the same principle behind the National Popular Vote movement. And what we want to build is a movement of millions of people who say it's outrageous that in this so-called representative democracy, my vote doesn't count as much as your vote. And if we can build millions behind that movement, then whatever happens in our lawsuit, we will have millions to turn to the cause of trying to get the states to also follow an even more perfect proportional system, which would be national popular vote. So our objectives are the same. We're all following different paths to try to get to the same end. But it is kind of crazy that we've got to be fighting in America in 2017 for a really simple idea that votes should count equally. But that's where we are.
And we should say with the NPV, there are 11 states with 165 electoral votes that have already enacted that compact into law. So there's still 105 short. And so you're talking about, depending on how you slice it, a lot of states that may not be amenable to it. Is there an opportunity for, we have a weird system with voting in this country where there's really no federal right to vote per se. There's no constitutional right to vote, I guess I should say. Is it possible you can go to different states and that states have within their constitution a similar concept about one vote, one person, and actually wage this on a state-by-state basis? Or is there no principle that the states uphold that is equivalent to that equal protection?
You could do it on a state-by-state basis, but it would be a really unfair thing to do to each of these states, because the winner-take-all system is something that every state basically felt like it had to adopt, because if it didn't adopt it, its power would be weaker relative to other states. If you're dividing 10 electors, 5 and 5, between a presidential candidate, you're less interesting to the presidential candidate than if you can promise them 10 electors if they come to your state and win the votes in your state. So that's the reason why states are kind of stably in this position, except for the very interesting Maine and Nebraska exceptions. And that's the reason why it needs to be resolved at the federal level by a federal court who sets one rule for the whole country, because you don't want to make it unfairly burdensome in some places and have a different rule in other places. And so that's why we're trying to get to the Supreme Court to get them to make the rule clear. And we hope they uphold the equality that makes it so everybody's vote counts equally. In 2016, 52 million Americans voted in a context where their vote just did not count. And that's just outrageous in what's called the greatest democracy in the world.
So with about 30 seconds left, your organization is called Equal Votes. How can people help support your case and this path to the Supreme Court?
Well, so they can go to equalvote.us. We're raising the funds we need to take this to the court. The lawyers that we are working with are going to do their work for free, but there are lots of costs associated with the experts necessary to establish the claims. So that's why we need to raise the funds in order to make it possible for us to take this case on. So equalvotes.us, and any support, especially the support of spreading the idea and spreading the message, would be enormously beneficial.
Equalvotes.us. All right. Well, we'll put that up at ringofireradio.com. Professor Lawrence Lessig, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Sam, thanks for having me.
Lawrence Lessig is the Roy L. Furman Professor of Law and Leadership at Harvard Law School and Director of the Edmund J. Safra Foundation Center for Ethics at Harvard University. When we come back, Heather Digby Parton will join us to analyze more news from the past week. That's just ahead. I'm Sam Seder. You're listening to Ring of Fire Radio. Check out rofpodcast.com to get your free 1-hour podcast.
Gotta fight every day to keep mediocrity at bay. Got to fight every day to keep mediocrity.
Insight Daily Radio. Mike Papantonio is a leading trial lawyer, the television host of America's Lawyer, and prolific author. His latest novel, Law and Vengeance, is an action-packed legal thriller with his main character, Gina Romano, in the crosshairs of America's largest arms manufacturer. We spoke with him about the book and the real-life issues that inform and inspire his writing.
I ended up being involved in really complex cases. I came at it as a prosecutor, and ended up having to handle some of the biggest cases in the country almost immediately against the asbestos manufacturers and pharmaceutical manufacturers. And in there, what happens is you develop a specialty, and this specialty is trial law. Most people believe that everybody's a trial lawyer, and they're not. The truth is, I think it's less than 1/3 of 1% of lawyers in this country are actually trial lawyers with trial skills that handle the kind of complex cases that I'm talking about. And so I ended up there. And it's interesting. By being there, it gave me kind of an interesting view of the world that maybe most people don't see, because I'm always on the other side of a table against a corporation that's created a pharmaceutical that's killing people, or a corporation that's polluting our waterways or our air knowingly, or a Wall Street entity that's stealing from mom and pop. So I always see that part of the story, and I collect the documents, and I take the depositions, and I try the cases. And in there, most of these books that I write kind of write themselves, because they're all based on actual events, actual cases that I handle.
That's trial lawyer, television host, and author Mike Papantonio on his latest novel, Law and Vengeance, which has just been released. Insight Daily Radio.